Hello, students. Welcome back. Glad you're tuning in. That means you're paying attention, wanting to learn, which is a good thing. This video is going to be part 2 about social psych, and we're going to look at classic research. 3 studies that were done that are kind of really classic studies in this field. One done by Solomon Asch on conformity, another done by Stanley Milgram about obedience, and finally one done by Philip Zimbardo about role playing. So let's get started. We're talking about social influence. Maybe the greatest contribution of social psych is the study of attitudes, beliefs, and decisions and actions, the way they are molded by social influence. So the conformity study, Solomon Asch did this. He had 8 men in a room. 7 of them were Confederates, means they were working with the researcher. They're pretending to be subjects, but they're not. And then there was one research subject. They're sitting around a table. Projected on the wall are these lines. And there's the standard line and 3 comparison lines. And the people are just asked which of the comparison lines is the same length as the standard line. Now, if you're looking at that, it's pretty easy to tell. But in the study, the 7 Confederates would all say the wrong answer. And then the question they were trying to find out is, what would the one research subject say? So this is a great picture of like what they're looking like in the study. You can see the one person staring at the wall really hard, trying to figure out which line it is. They found out that 37% of the research subjects conformed when the answer was obviously wrong. They still would say the wrong answer, which is a shockingly high percentage of people. When they interviewed people after the study was done, they said they knew that the right answer was the right answer, but they didn't want to be different. Now, interestingly, if just one of the Confederates said the right answer, then nobody would conform. None of the subjects would conform if one other person said the right answer. So, some interesting things about conformity there. This brought about like a question of, well, what types of things contribute to conformity? So there's different strength conditions that strengthen conformity. One is if there are 3 or more people. 2 is if the group is unanimous. And 3 would be that if the subject admires the group's status and their attractiveness. So Asch found this out by doing a bunch of variations on his experiment. How many people, whether they were unanimous or not. So that's how he found out these conditions that strengthen conformity. Now, another thing they talked about was reasons that people conformed, and there's kind of 2 reasons that people conform. One is called the normative social influence. This results from a person's desire to gain approval or avoid punishment. So you may respect the normative behavior because there's a severe price to pay if not respected. So in your social group, your peer group at school, if you step outside what the group is thinking or doing, you might be an outcast, and you might no longer be part of that group if you don't conform to that group. There's also the informational social influence. This is when you're influenced by valuable information. So this would be like kind of a good thing if you get some new information about a subject and then you change your mind and you conform because of the new information. Okay, another classic study was the Stanley Milgram research study. Now, you can find a link to this video about this on my website, and I highly recommend you watch that. We might even watch it in class. The Milgram experiment, the video is like 50 minutes, but it's just outstanding. He was studying what if people were asked to be obedient to a command that maybe was a little too much, a little over the top. So he had a study where the setup was that there was a subject and there was a learner. And the learner was a Confederate, and the teacher was the real experimental subject. And they were told that the teacher would ask a series of questions, and if the learner got it wrong, the teacher would shock the learner, like an electrical shock. And they were in separate rooms. And the teacher had this gauge in front of them, a machine that looked, this was the machine, and on it, it said the different levels of shock. And every time the learner missed something, they would go up a level of shock. So the teacher is shocking them more and more. The learner would start to scream as the shocks got higher. And the learner also told the teacher at the very beginning that they had a heart condition. So they have a the teacher thinks they have a heart condition and thinks they're screaming. The screaming is fake. It's not real screaming because the person's not really getting shocked. But they're in a separate room. The teacher thinks they're being shocked. So the question is, how high would people go? How obedient would they be? Because the experimenter was sitting there telling them, you must shock, you must continue researching, you must continue asking questions, you must continue shocking. So how obedient would they be? Well, here's the graph of the results. At the slight shock, 100% were obedient. You can see the obedience goes down slightly as the shock comes more intense, but the people shocked all the way past the extreme level, past the danger level, to the final level was just called triple X, and 66% shocked all the way to triple X. Now that's shocking because you should also know the learner was screaming, and then when it gets really high, the learner just goes silent and there's no more screaming, but people kept shocking them. So the results were just mind-blowing that people would shock someone who they think has a heart condition, who's screaming, and then who goes silent, but they would keep shocking them. They would keep being obedient. So about 2/3 went all the way. Now, this was done like back in the 50s, maybe the 60s. And so people thought, oh, well, no one would shock like that today. In 2009, they did a remake of the experiment, same levels of obedience. Afterwards, people said they were obedient because it didn't feel like they had a choice, although they did. They said they didn't feel responsible because it was the experimenters was telling them to do it, and the experimenter was responsible for the experiment. And they said they learned to be obedient just as kids were taught to be obedient. We're obedient to teachers, we're obedient to our parents. So Milgram did some variations of the experiment, and they found out what decreased obedience. If the teacher could see the learner, obedience went way down. If the experimenter wasn't standing next to them, but was giving orders by phone, obedience went way down. And the original experiment was conducted at Yale University on the campus. And if they moved the research off campus to a strip mall and just did it in a random place, obedience went down. So they thought that the prestige of Yale made obedience higher than if it was just in a strip mall. So lessons learned. In both Ash's and Milgram's study, participants were pressured to choose between following their standards and being responsive to others. In both situations, the social setting overwhelmed a lot of people and caused them to be conforming with the lines or obedient with the shocking. So the social situation was extremely powerful in both of these situations. The final experiment was about role-playing affecting attitudes. So this psychologist, Philip Zimbardo, he assigned some of the research participants to be prison guards and some of them to be prisoners, and he had their consent. They agreed to do it. They picked them up. They built a fake jail. They put them in the fake jail. By the way, there's also a really good video of this linked on my website. It's about an hour long, 50 minutes, maybe 40 minutes. Outstanding video if you want to see what this was really like. So they built the fake jail, and then things took a life of their own. The research subjects took on the roles and adopted the attitudes of cops or not cops, but prison guards, and adopted the attitudes of prisoners. So the guards became abusive really quickly. They had deprived the prisoners of food and bathrooms, and the prisoners became submissive. They would do whatever the prisoner guard said, even when they were being ridiculed and asked to do humiliating things. The study had to be canceled after 2 or 3 days. The behavior was getting so severe, and people were being mistreated so poorly. So they canceled the experiment. Um, Zimbardo's research was interesting because it had some real life applications about how prison guards should be trained and how prisoners should be treated. So he became a consultant for prisons all around the world. In 2005 or 6, during the Iraq War, the U.S. occupation of Iraq, um, there was a prison set up, and a lot of American prisoner guards were really abusive to the Iraqi prisoners. And so Zimbardo became a consultant for that as well. So there's some ethical concerns about all these research. Some of them consider Milgram and Zimbardo's experiments to be unethical because people had a lot of distress during the research and after. So quick recap on ethics. You have to have your research approved by an independent review board. You have to have informed consent. If there's deception, it has to be approved, and you have to debrief and tell people what it was about. Okay, so those are 3 classic experiments. Make sure if this is interesting to you, you check out the links on my website to these 2 experiments. If you have any questions, see me in class.